Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm David Myers, host of this episode and director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, which sponsors the podcast. I'm pleased to welcome to today's show my friend and colleague in the UCLA History Department, Professor Sebouh Aslanian, who holds the Richard Hovhannisyan Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History. We are going to be talking about events in the contested region of Nagorno-Karabakh, also known by the Armenian name Artsakh, located in the Republic of Azerbaijan in the Caucasus Mountains. The region contains a population of about 150,000, three-quarters of whom are Armenian. For over a century, Armenians and Azerbaijanis have struggled for control here, with wars being waged between the two populations. The Armenian majority has alternately aspired to independence or unification with the Republic of Armenia, which is about 100 miles west of the region. Azerbaijan, for its part, wants to bring this restive regime under its control, and according to many, has gone to great and brutal lengths to achieve this end. It intensified its blockade of the region in March 2023 and commenced a new offensive in September. These actions prompted Luis Moreno Ocampo, the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, to declare already on August 7th, 2023, that, quote, there is a reasonable basis to believe that a genocide is being committed against Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh, unquote. Meanwhile, on September 20th, a ceasefire was reached through the offices of Russian peacekeeping forces. But the situation remains dire, with reports that Azerbaijani forces are preventing food and basic supplies from reaching the core Armenian population. To help us understand the region and its import, we're going to turn to Professor Sebouh Aslanian. Welcome, Sebouh.
Thank you, David. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to address a vital issue on your very important platform.
So, can you set the stage for us and just sort of tell us where we're at in the world when we talk about Nagorno-Karabakh?
Sure. I'm going to begin by making a larger kind of reflection first, and then I will return to your question. I've been teaching Armenian history at UCLA for 10, 12 years, and one of the things I've learned about Armenians is that they are the quintessential small nation. And ever since the 44-day war to which you alluded, perhaps, I think, of 2020, which has brought us directly to this dire and tragic situation today, I've had as my footer on my emails a really well-known but little understood quotation from the great and late Czech writer Milan Kundera. And the quotation is from an article he wrote for the New York Review of Books in 1982 or 83, and it goes something like this. But what is a small nation? He asks. And Kundera immediately follows by saying, and I quote, I offer you my definition. A small nation is one whose very existence may be put into question, and at any given moment, the small nation can disappear, and it knows it. So I say the Armenians are a quintessential small nation, along with a number of others, particularly in Eastern Europe, and also especially the one that Kundera focuses on as well, namely the Jews. I say they're a small nation because not necessarily because of size as what is most commonly confused for in this situation, but in terms of geography. Being small is not a function of quantity for Kundera, but a function of location. And what he means by this essentially is that it's the in-between location of these nations that are sandwiched tightly between two rival empires or imperial formations. Of course, this applies to the bloodlands of Eastern Europe. Even Poland is a small nation, even though in numbers it's not. But it especially applies to this neck of woods where I am at the moment, to the South Caucasus. I'm speaking to you from Yerevan. So Armenians have been a small nation in the sense that from the very beginning of their history, they've been buffered and surrounded by two rival imperial powers, On the Western Front, they've had Greco-Roman imperial powers, beginning with the Roman Empire, Alexander the Great, and so forth, and then followed by a succession of other empires, particularly the Byzantines, later on the Ottomans, and so on. On the eastern side, Armenians have almost perennially been uh, buffered by Iranians, particularly the ancient civilization of Parthian Iran, to which Armenia is very intimately connected. We are, in a way, in a sense, a branch of that dynasty here, and we share many cultural traits with the Iranians. Hence, one reason why Iran has been, in some ways, a trusted ally of sorts to the Armenians. Cultural ties are deep with our neighbors to the south. But after the Iranians, of course, the Arabs have come, the Seljuk Turks have come, the Mongols, and a host of others, culminating with the Ottomans, and then most recently, of course, the Russians, which brings us to where we are at the moment. So Armenia is an in-between nation. And of course, this has been both a blessing and a curse. To quote one of my favorite Armenian historians, Nina Garsoyan, the formidable Nina Garsoyan, who unfortunately passed away a year ago or so today, a year ago. She essentially says that the blessing of being a small nation and being in between is that Armenia, in its location at the point of articulation of these great powers, has meant that Armenia has benefited culturally from flows from either direction. It's culturally extremely rich.
So if Armenia is a between nation, Nagorno-Karabakh is a between entity. All the more so.
All the more so, for sure. But in terms of this connects to Nagorno-Karabakh in terms of the curse of being in between. The curse, of course, is that while you're culturally potentially rich, politically, your political boundaries and your statehood is at the mercy of these powers, and that your position determines instability, and hence, I go back to Kundera, it makes you almost always on the threshold of extinction. And you worry about it, and it shapes the way you think, your psyche, how you dream at night sometimes, your cultural dispositions, your fears, and so forth. And this is basically, I think, a kind of setting that's useful for us to put in place before returning to your more direct question, which has to do with where Nagorno-Karabakh is and what it is, essentially. So in a nutshell, Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh as it is known to Armenians, is a tiny region of approximately 1,700 square miles, roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island. And it is contained within the international boundaries of Azerbaijan. The name itself, the sobriquet from Russian, Nagorny or Nagorno, of course, indicates mountainous, and of course, it also tells us that the region is a high altitude area with mist-covered forests, dotted with hundreds, if not thousands, of ancient and medieval Armenian monasteries, churches, and other cultural heritage sites. And of course, leaving aside popular media presentations of Armenians as having been there only in the recent decades, one can say that the high altitude nature of this terrain has ensured an Armenian presence in the area for at least 2 millennia, if not longer.
Why does the high altitude attract an Armenian population?
Because the geography of the terrain, if anyone has been there, is such that it makes it impregnable almost. In the old days, before the age of drone warfare, it's a place that is basically a mountain fastness, and it allows a small number of people to defend itself in relatively easier terms than would have otherwise been the case. And so the region is important for Armenians for multiple reasons. But one of the reasons is because in the most crucial turning point in the larger scheme of Armenian history, the longue durée of Armenian history, namely the 10th, 11th centuries, which witnessed a turmoil of the history of the entire region, and particularly of the Isthmus region of the South Caucasus, which lies between the Black and Caspian Seas. That area in the 11th century, early to mid 11th century, witnessed significant and destabilizing transformations. For on the one hand, it became the primal focal point of the arrival of tens of thousands of Seljuk Turks from Central Asia, whose arrival coincided with the rebounding of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, no friends to the Armenians, even though they're Christian, because of different confessional loyalties. Their rebounding and expansion to the east, where the Armenians were. And so by the end of this period, when all the dust had settled from the storm, Armenians found themselves as having lost two of their major kingdoms on the plateau that bears their name, namely the Bakradid kingdom with its capital in Ani, medieval capital of Ani, which is a pile of ruins now on the other side of the Turkish border in northern Armenia, and the second kingdom, which was the Artsruni kingdom of Vaspuragan, headquartered in the region of Lake Van and known today to some of our listeners perhaps for the architectural wonder that they created, which is the Cathedral of Akhtamar of Holy Cross in the middle of Lake Van in eastern Turkey. So the only remaining Armenian entity, political entity where Armenians clung to power at this point was in the mountainous region of Artsakh, where from the early 12th century, approximately 1100 and so on, until the end of the 13th century, a kingdom known as the medieval kingdom of Artsakh, ruled by Armenians, flourished. And of course, with this kingdom collapsed in subsequent centuries, but was replaced by smaller Armenian principalities known as meliks or melikdoms, which were basically Armenian principalities ruled in a very delicate kind of balance of power with neighboring Turks and Muslims who lived mostly in the lowland regions of Artsakh. The mountainous area was predominantly Armenian, but the lowlands were overwhelmingly Turkish with some Armenian presence.
Okay, can you bring us to the 20th century and begin to explain to us wherein lies the source of enmity between Armenians and Azerbaijanis?
So I'll bring us to the 20th century, but I think it's important to highlight very quickly the 19th century and what came slightly before that, because of the generalization that I'm going to make about this region as a whole that sets things into context as we move on with this conversation. And that is that if we look at the region of the Nagorno-Karabakh or the South Caucasus as a whole, what kind of generalizations can we make that might have some kind of impact on what's going on today? And I think I've thought about this. I think two generalizations can be made in terms of two constants that have shaped the trajectory of the region's peoples and their histories. The first thing is that the region has almost always been ruled by external imperial powers, even as far back as the Roman period and so on. And particularly with Iranian dominance, there's been very strong imperial presence, and the imperial powers at the time have brought with them their own practices, their own codes of conduct, and so on, that have shaped the way that people in the middle have interrelated with one another. And of course, the idea of imperial rule is really crucial because it goes back to your question of why the enmity. I'll address that in a second. The second characteristic defining feature of this complex geography and history is that the region is a petri dish for extreme ethnic, linguistic, religious, tribal, and other forms of diversity. From the time of the ancient Greek mariners to the Arab conquerors and so on, the region was known for being very rich in the multiplicity of peoples. The Arab polymath and geographer al-Masudi, for instance, referred to the area as Jabal al-Alsun, or the mountain of tongues, reflecting its heterogeneous nature. And of course, heterogeneity and empire go in hand, because whenever empires have been strong, usually the heterogeneous population in the middle have found different ways of convivencia or convenienza, depending on how you look at it. They have essentially interacted and cross-culturally and lived in the same territory without bloodletting. But whenever the imperial power has been weakened, this has, of course, unleashed serious violence from the middle. And of course, here I have to skip to the 19th century when another empire looms into the picture. And of course, here I'm referring to the Russian Empire that expanded southwards and in a series of occupations 1813 to 1828, with the Treaty of Gulistan and the Treaty of Turkmenchai, Russia absorbed the entirety of the South Caucasus into its imperial domain. And then, of course, Armenians then found themselves not living in a kind of Persianate adab or Persianate cultural system with Persian Iranian Safavid domination that kept things later on things, but rather in a Russian kind of version of that Iranian structure. And of course, that enabled some form of coexistence until, of course, there were periods of Russian imperial weakness. And there were two periods of weakness involving the Russians. 1905, during the First Revolution, when the center was weak, Armeno-Tatar or Armeno-Azerbaijani conflict resulted in bloodshed and the killings of thousands of people on both sides. The second period of weakness of the center was in 1918, in the middle of the First World War. Of course, here I have to pause for 1 second and say another empire is also into this picture. That is the Ottoman Empire to the west. And in the First World War, as many of our listeners might know, the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, who were the majority of the Armenians in the world, experienced the genocide, which resulted in the killing of up to 1.5 million Armenians. And of course, that period of weakness in the middle of the First World War also brought about a power vacuum in the region, with Russian imperial weakness from Tiflis, the administrative center of the South Caucasus, and that allowed the three major nationalities of the Caucasus, the Georgians in the north, the Armenians in the middle, and the Azerbaijani Turks to the east, to briefly form a Trans-Caucasian Federative Republic, a stillborn entity which only lasted for 1 month and collapsed under Ottoman pressure. Of course, when the entity collapsed, each of these constituent nationalities made a bid for nationhood and nation states of their own. The Georgians went first, the Azeris followed next, and then the Armenians, of course, followed suit as well. And right during this period of independence for 2 years for the Armenians and most of the other peoples as well, the republics that were on the scene engaged in serious territorial disputes. And one of those disputes involved the dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan on two important geographical regions. Nagorno-Karabakh was chief among them, but there was also the region of Nakhichevan to the east of Armenia, which is now on the Turkish border, and the region of southern Armenia, the southern cone, known as Zangezur. And of course, I should say that when Armenia declared independence, it did so in the context of an ongoing genocide, and it had about 300,000 orphans and genocide survivors. And during the first year of independence, in the first winter, 200,000 of those people died of starvation. So this was a very inglorious birth, to quote the late Richard Ovanesyan. Is a republic that was born at the worst possible moment, but somehow it survived.
So just in understanding the sort of developments in the wake of the First World War and the collapse of empire and the short-lived experiment in this transnational federation, in thinking of the nature of relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, there's obviously a national tension as these two small nations are aspiring to achieve a measure of sovereignty, or at least a strong form of autonomy. But there's also a religious difference between the two. And I'm wondering how you understand, again, to return to my question, the nature of the enmity between these two groups. Is it a mixture, a kind of toxic brew of religious and national differences and sentiments?
Exactly. So to give you a hopefully short answer, there are basically two schools of thought on what drives Azeri-Armenian enmity. The first school, of course, is going back to what you were alluding to, focuses on religious differences. The conflict is often represented as a conflict of religions and a clash of civilizations that is religiously tainted. I don't think this is entirely irrelevant. The religion does play a role, but I believe that religion is often in many other conflicts as well.
We should just clarify: Armenians are Christians and Azerbaijanis are Muslims.
Armenians are Christians. They pride themselves on being the first Christian nation in the world, early 4th century, which is when many of the religious centers in Karabakh, some of them date back to that period. So the Azeris, on the other hand, are Turkic. They speak a Turkic language. Armenians speak an Indo-European language. The Azeris are almost exclusively Muslim, and they're also Shia Muslims. They're not Sunnis for the most part. The majority of Azeris are Shia Muslims. So it's easy to see this as a Islam Muslim versus Christian conflict, because often enough Armenian churches are turned into gravel or transformed into mosques and so on. So many Armenians and many Azeris, I'm sure many others, would confuse this conflict as a religious one. But this would be missing out on a crucial component, which is that it's not really only religion. Religion does play a role, but it's manipulated and acts more like a cloak than anything else. So, of course, this leaves us with a second school of explanation, which is very popular in the media and was especially popular in the 1990s. And I started my career studying nationalism to dispute this school of thinking, which is that it reduces complexity of these conflicts to ancient hatreds and so forth, as if Armenians and Turks were born to hate each other and have always hated each other. This, of course, is a primordial kind of what historians would call the primordial thesis of identities and conflicts. This, too, has elements of truth, but needless to say, it's a simplification, and both of them are dangerous ways of explaining a complex relationship. So this leaves us with a question, so what drives the conflict? I would say what drives the conflict would be a combination of different different factors that have to figure into the way we understand it. The first and foremost, I would say, is empire. Empire, but particularly the Soviet type of empire. And second, I would say, connected to the Soviet empire, is the strengthening of nationalist, in some ways even racialized nationalist thought and practice within the Soviet empire itself. As the Soviet Union was created, up until the 1990s, most scholars thought the Soviet Union was a prison house of nations, that it was a place where nations eventually melted. It was a melting pot. But of course, as the great Ron Sunni pointed out as early as 1991, as a consequence of the First Karabakh War, the Soviet Union was not a melting pot of nations. It was actually the opposite. It was an incubator of nations. Each of the republics that was given its own state, with all the paraphernalia of a nation state, was given titular nationality status, and the minorities in that republic were, to a large extent, submerged into the titular nationalities' nation-building projects.
But Sebouh, we have a situation in which we seem to be positing that can't live with empire, can't live without it. Empire has the capacity to hold together and constrain small nations from engaging in often brutal warfare against one another. And yet, as you say, it's also the incubator of precisely those sentiments. So, I mean, it's a curious predicament that we find ourselves in, because in the wake of the First World War and the collapse of the Russian Empire, in the case of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we see this unleashing of nationalist sentiments that often took on quite bloody form.
Definitely. It's empire obviously is a messy business, and it's quite contradictory and paradoxical. On the one hand, as you say, there is an element of restraint available in imperial dominance from outside that keeps people in place, or that keeps them in some form of hierarchical convivencia on some level of unequal power, but constrained in a kind of an atmosphere of contained conflict. But on the other hand, the empire also actively creates conditions where conflict can be focalized as a national conflict, not necessarily a religious one, and so on. All the other factors come to be subservient to the larger project of nation building, and which is based on purification and homogenization. And so minorities living in the middle are ethnically cleansed as a result, and their histories are absorbed into the histories of the dominant nationality. And this is the case with Karabakh, because once it was part of as an autonomous oblast within the Soviet Union under Azerbaijani rule from 1924 onwards until 1988, and when empire weakened again and under perestroika and glasnost, and the Armenians began to demonstrate for more cultural autonomy and so on, and then eventually asked for their oblast or region to be moved from Azeri control into the neighboring Republic of Armenia. Both of them were Soviet at the time, so it was within the same state. And of course, this released a series of pogroms against them in Ganja as well as Baku in 1988 and 1990. Hundreds of Armenians were ethnically cleansed and subjected to pogroms. And of course, the same happened on the Armenian side vis-a-vis the Armenians, so vis-a-vis the Azerbaijanis. On both sides, cleansings.
Ethnic cleansing.
Each republic.
In the war, the conflict that breaks out in 1988 as the Soviet Union is beginning to dissolve, and focus turns to Nagorno-Karabakh as a site of this intense contestation between Azeris and Armenians. What was the outcome of that phase of the conflict?
The outcome of that phase of the conflict was that in 1992, when the Soviet Union crumbled and unraveled, Armenia declared independence. Each of the 15 titular nationalities and the republics declared independence, and of course, so did Azerbaijan. And both republics almost immediately went to war over this disputed region, which had been festering since '88. In any case, and as a result of 4 or 5 years of warfare, from 1990 to '94, the Armenian side eventually prevailed. When the war ended with a ceasefire in May of 1994, Armenians in Karabakh, despite all odds, had prevailed, and they had basically not only managed to maintain hold of their own republic, but they had driven a large number of Azeris out. And to be fair, on both sides, there were extreme cases of ethnic cleansings. About 740,000 Azeris were pushed out of regions in Azerbaijan or even in Armenia. Another 500,000 Armenians were also ethnically cleansed from parts of Azerbaijan, including Baku, and as well as parts of Nagorno-Karabakh. But when all the dust had settled in '94, the Armenian side had full control not only of Artsakh, but also of neighboring regions of Azerbaijan itself. And this was the situation as a stalemate until September 29th of 2020, when the 44-day war broke out between the two republics.
The second war in the post.
Exactly. Yeah. During that time, of course, Azerbaijan had access to limitless petroleum reserves and so on from 1999 onwards. Everybody here in Armenia knew that Azerbaijan, there was no holding it back because they were becoming stronger and stronger. And of course, with all the petroleum money flooding into their coffers, they were able to build a very strong army. They were able to purchase drones from Turkey, Russia, and Israel, state-of-the-art drones, which had a determinative kind of outcome in the result of the 44-day war.
Right. So just to take stock of where we are, the first conflict war that breaks out in 1988 lasts 6 years to 1994. Ends up with Armenia in control.
Yes.
But it opens up a 26-year period in which Azerbaijan seeks to restore control over the region, which is embedded in the middle of its country. And in 2020, a second conflict breaks out that yields a different result, which is to say, Azerbaijan gains military control over the region.
Yes, not only that, but it gains not only complete control of the region, but also gains control of the region of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. And of course, that conflict itself, the 44-day war, ended in a ceasefire with Armenia, the Armenian side forced to sign capitulate and sign a ceasefire of sorts, which, of course, was violated multiple times over, and most recently, only about a week ago or so, on the 19th of September, to be more precise, the Azerbaijani side launched attacks against the civilian population targets in Artsakh itself, in Stepanakert. They don't regard the region as Armenian. They regard its churches, its monuments, and so on, not as Armenian, but as quote-unquote Caucasian Albanian, these people who had disappeared in the 8th century, and people who were Christians and very close to the Armenians, that the Azeri side, ever since 1965, in an act of bold revisionism, has been claiming to be their ancestor state. And all this as a way of undercutting any kind of Armenian cultural rights to that region, so that Armenian cemeteries, churches, cathedrals, and so on are either, like I said, transformed into gravel or claimed to be Caucasian Albanian, even though everything about them is Armenian, the writing is Armenian, the history is Armenian, the people who live there and so on are Armenian. They're presented as Caucasian Albanian and ipso facto as crypto-Azerbaijani and therefore under Azeri control.
So in addition to that historical revisionism, which, as you note, extends back to 1965, Azerbaijan has gained complete control and is restricting access to food and other vital supplies to Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And yet the Russians have brokered some form of a cessation of hostilities. And here's the sort of interesting and to the outsider vexing piece, which is the Republic of Armenia, as represented by its prime minister, Nikol Pashinyan, agreed to the terms of that cessation of hostilities. Can you help us explain what the interest of Mr. Pashinyan was here?
Well, Mr. Pashinyan, I'm afraid, has a very limited number of choices to make. And that's being gracious, probably. So in December of last year, 2022, more than a year after the cessation of hostilities, the only connecting link to Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, was this place called the Lachin corridor that had been under Armenian control but fell to the Azeris during the 44-day war. That corridor was vital because that corridor ensured the delivery of food items and so on, electricity and other things into this besieged enclave. But starting in December, the Lachin corridor was shut down by Azeri forces. Even international Red Cross vehicles were not allowed to go in. And beginning in June, 4 months ago or so, Azerbaijan essentially began an extreme blockade of that region, not only blocking the road access, but also starving the Armenian population into submission. And of course, a few days ago, they succeeded. After 9 months of starvation, the population of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, had no choice but to lay down its arms, which is what the Azeris wanted them to do. And of course, now there are a number of dire possibilities that await their fate. None of them are good, unfortunately.
So again, Mr. Pashinyan felt he had no option given the situation on the ground. And I'm curious to hear from you what the interests of the larger regional actors are. What's the Russian stake in the conflict? What is the Turkish stake in the conflict? Where is Iran?
Sure. Well, the Russian stake is perhaps the one that's somewhat easier to respond to, and that is that Russia, of course, is an imperial power, and empire has been a constant in this region. And in the context of this larger discussion earlier, I can say that Armenians have always appealed to the Russians as a kind of big brother protector in the neighborhood.
Fellow Christians amongst others, facing off against a potential
combination, yes, from a different mother, a very different mother. But in any case, fellow Christians. But obviously, religion, as I said, is almost always a foil for other interests. So Putin, beginning in 2018, when Pashinyan came to power, began to be worried about the pivoting nature of Pashinyan's rule. Pashinyan represented a threat to Putin's form of government because Pashinyan was a democratically elected person. Unlike Azerbaijan, which is a dictatorial, essentially a gangster state run by a gangster family of thugs, the Aliyev family. And I'm not saying this only because I have obvious biases in this conflict, but this is a well-known fact, even among Azeri dissidents. So the only democratic state in this region, of course, now is Armenia, and Georgia is also democratic. The only times that Russia has shifted its position and weight has been when it has been facing a country where the leader has been democratically elected. The obvious case, of course, is Ukraine. But there is also the case of the 2008 Russian invasion of Georgia, which is also predicated on the fact that the Georgians had a democracy. Putin clearly is someone who cannot tolerate a Western-style democratically elected government with a Western orientation. And Pashinyan made clear when he came to power that his issue wasn't in reorienting himself from Russia. He wanted to reorient Armenia's governance away from 26, 27 years of a kleptocracy and authoritarian regime that Putin supported, and that was more in line with Putin's interest. And I think that is the most crucial issue to me. I think the Russian decision to abandon the Armenians to the tender mercies of their neighbors is predicated on the style of government rather than what the particular individual has done.
And what about other regional actors? What do Turkey and Iran? Of course, Israel has asserted itself prominently, not on the side of the Armenians, but on the side of the Azerbaijanis.
Exactly. So Turkey, that's also an easier issue to address. Turkey obviously is a successor state to a genocidal empire, the Ottoman Empire. To this day, they don't recognize the Armenian genocide. And as late as as recently as 2020, Prime Minister Erdogan publicly said that referred to the Armenians as the remnants of the sword. That is to say, people who were left over from the genocide. And he said their numbers have diminished, but they have not been exterminated or finished yet. And this was a veiled threat against Christians and Armenians, particularly, coming at a time when a war was on the frontier, on the horizon with Azerbaijan. Of course, Turkey has been supporting Azerbaijan. Turkey did not support Azerbaijan in the first war, but in the second war, Turkish military assistance, leadership, advisory positions, and so on, all of them have made significant difference in favor of Azerbaijan's victory in the 44-day war. Of course, this also brings in the Iranians to the south, the region being an imperial region. Iranians have been historically very close to the Armenians, but Iran and Azerbaijan have significant issues. Iran is concerned about Azeri irredentism vis-a-vis northern Iran, which has a large number of Azeri Turkic population. And so Israel, obviously, for obvious reasons, is diametrically opposed to Iran because Iran has threatened Israel's existence. And so Israel has found itself as a state that is the offspring of a Holocaust, supporting a regime and a state that is perpetrating a genocide against survivors of a genocide, the Armenians. And all of this, of course, is in the interests of larger geopolitical factors.
And it would say, in order to protect the interests of the remaining Jewish community in Azerbaijan. But there are indeed much larger geopolitical factors at work. Sebouh, I'm wondering what you would hope the response of the international community to be, and particularly the European Union and the United States, to the current situation, the current dire situation.
Yes. The current situation is that Nagorno-Karabakh Artsakh is being ethnically cleansed. At the moment, it's unclear as to whether the remaining 120,000 plus Armenians in the region even have the right of return. I don't mean the right of return to your place of origin, but the right of return in another sense, the right of moving out of the region where they are clearly targeted for genocide to Armenia. And of course, I think there's still negotiations or discussions. I'm not sure what the Azeri position is. They are building camps to support these remnants of the sword in Nagorno-Karabakh. What kind of camps they are, I can't say for sure. And I'm not sure if they will allow the population to leave, because anyone who's any male member of the population there automatically will be decapitated, tortured, and so on. This is very, very widely known to the media. In addition to demolishing Armenian heritage sites and so on, they've also been engaged in quite explicit acts of human rights violations involving decapitations, tortures of elderly people merely on the basis of their Armenian origin or Armenian identity. So at the moment, what can the international community do? Obviously, there was a United Nations Security Council meeting a couple of nights ago, but there was a lot of talk as usual, and I'm not sure what. The one thing there are two things, in my view, that I think the international community should do. I'm not sure if they will do it. Two things that must be done. First, I think all the the survivors of Karabakh, the Armenian population of Karabakh, 120,000 people basically held hostage. I think those who want to leave with their rights and selling their property, etc., with certification and so forth, should be guaranteed by international monitors and internationally enforced mechanisms to safely leave the area, essentially ethnically cleansing it by force from the Azeri side and moving to Armenia for safety. That's the first thing that must be done if they want to leave. And I'm sure that given the way that the Aliyev regime treats its own citizens, I'm sure none of them would want to stay there, particularly given the genocidal discourse and rhetoric and acts that have been in plain view for too long a time. Second thing that they ought to do, I think, is to ensure that the remaining hundreds of Armenian churches and cathedrals are not either demolished or transformed into Caucasian Albanian sanctuaries that then are by ipso facto Azeri, because for some reason that has to do with invented traditions of essentially fabricating history, they're seen to be Caucasian Albanian and not Armenian, in fact, whereas everybody in the international scholarly community knows that these kinds of revisionist acts are truly not only fairy tale acts, but truly dangerous and mind-bogglingly disastrous for the minority community of the Armenians. So heritage sites should be preserved. People should be given the right of leaving with safety and dignity as much as these things are possible in this very sad, sad world. And I will conclude by saying that just this morning I woke up thinking about a passage from the 1918 memoirs of Ambassador Morgenthau, who was, of course, as we know, an American Jewish ambassador in Istanbul during the Ottoman Empire, during the Armenian Genocide. And he records dialogues that he had with Talat Pasha, the architect of the Armenian Genocide, in which Talat Pasha makes ominous threats, including one where he asks Morgenthau why he's interested in saving Christians since he is a Jew himself. And Morgenthau says he's, of course, an American and he's a human being, and that's what his business is. Secondly, Talat Pasha then says, it's enough. It's useless to try. We've already disposed of 3/4 of the Armenians. There are no Armenians left in the east. And at this point, we must finish with what we started, because Armenians and Turks can never be friends after this. Because if we let them live, they will take revenge on us. And my biggest fear at this point, as a citizen and a human being and as an Armenian as well, as a historian, my biggest fear right now is that Azerbaijan has its eyes set on Armenia as part of Western Azerbaijan, because there is a policy of a greater Azerbaijan talk about nationalism. And they've even gone about renaming Armenian places on Google Maps and on popular sites online like bookings.com and so on. And I think the larger objective right now, the danger could be that they want to reenact the Talat Pasha dialogue with Ambassador Morgenthau in terms of finishing off so that the Armenians cannot come back and do to them what they've done to the Armenians. So this, of course, is a very bleak situation.
Well, on that very ominous note, and I know I speak for many and very much hoping and praying that not be the outcome of this terrible conflict, I want to thank my colleague and friend, Professor Sebouh Aslanian, the Richard Hovhannisyan Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History, for making time out of your busy schedule in Yerevan to be with us on this episode of Then and Now.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.